This talk seeks to answer the question, is modern science compatible with the Christian faith? Its purpose is twofold. First, it seeks to show that contrary to the claim of most media pundits and progressive intellectuals, there is no incompatibility between modern science and the Christian faith. Second, it seeks to prove that the Judeo-Christian tradition contributed quite significantly to the development of modern science, and that indeed the scientific revolution of the 17th century might never have taken place without it. Some 150 years ago, Louis Pasteur, the founder of microbiology, argued that, and I quote, "A little science distances one from God, but a lot of science brings one nearer to him," end of quote. I propose to show how wise and insightful those words prove to be. For almost 4 centuries, a certain school of thought has been arguing that faith and reason, and more specifically, science and religion, are incompatible. This idea, put forth by Enlightenment thinkers, proved to be both hardy and persistent. In the 19th century, the writings of Auguste Comte and Ernest Renan contributed to its general acceptance by French public intellectuals. Renan even went so far as to argue that science, and I quote, "is worthy only to the extent that it can replace religion," end of quote. In the Anglosphere of the 19th century, scientists like Thomas Huxley and Charles Darwin in England, as well as Andrew Dixon White and John William Draper in the United States, authored various books arguing that ancestral religion and modern science were incompatible. Today, the idea of faith and science being incompatible is upheld by science communicators such as Michel Onfray, Richard Dawkins, or Neil Thyssen, as well as by the philosophical pillars of the American left, for example, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, and Peter Singer. My main thesis is that this alleged incompatibility has nothing to do with science and everything to do with an ideological project which, wittingly or unwittingly, neutralizes the moral and cultural influence of Christianity. Now one may ask, how can anyone put forth such a thesis and dare to cast doubt on a sacred dogma of our postmodernist academic establishment? Well, for one thing, many great scientists believe in God and have no qualms about expressing their faith publicly. Here are a few examples. Nicholas Copernicus, founder of heliocentric cosmology. Johannes Kepler, founder of physical astronomy. William Harvey, founder of experimental physiology. Isaac Newton, founder of modern physics and calculus. Louis Pasteur, founder of microbiology. Max Planck, father of quantum theory. Georges Lemaitre, father of the Big Bang theory. Werner Heisenberg, a founder of quantum mechanics. To this list could be added hundreds of names of less well-known scientists. The fact of the matter is that a large proportion of contemporary scientists believe in God. This is made clear by a survey carried out in 2009 by the Pew Research Center on the basis of a questionnaire sent to all member scientists of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, which happens to be the world's largest scientific association of its kind. According to the survey, a little over half of American scientists believe in God or in a supreme power. More specifically, 33% said they believed in God and 18% in a universal spirit or superior power. What is opposed to religion is not science, but rather a materialistic understanding of nature. The opposition can take one of two forms: philosophical materialism or scientific materialism. So let's look at each of these separately. Philosophical materialism is based on a set of unfounded claims regarding science and religion. It existed prior to the scientific revolution of the 17th century, but has always remained alive because of its basic accord with certain false ideas that grew out of that revolution. Philosophical materialism is based on what logicians call circular reasoning. It posits as premises what it purports to demonstrate. It affirms that anything that cannot be reduced to physical or mathematical relations cannot be the object of a rational explanation. And it then goes on to argue that any truly rational explanation can only take the form of mathematical equations and quantifiable data. Its motto is, "Where nothing is quantifiable, nothing exists." And if one asks on what ground such a peremptory statement rests, the answer is that since quantitative explanation can explain everything in physics, they can explain everything, period, because everything that exists is of a physical nature. Yet, this very statement, "everything that exists is of a physical nature," has nothing to do with science. Indeed, it is utterly unscientific because it is impossible to give it a formulation rooted in quantifiable data. That is, it cannot be empirically tested and therefore lies beyond the scope of science. It is in fact a metaphysical statement. That means we are in effect going around in circles. When asked to justify itself, philosophical materialism keeps begging the question. It assumes what it purports to prove. Now a word about scientific materialism. It rests on the unproven assumption that empirical science is the only legitimate source of knowledge. It further goes on to assert that there is no empirical evidence for the existence of God or of a spiritual world, and that, therefore, the only reasonable view is that there is no God. Our material universe is a closed system of physical causes and effects, and nothing that is external to it can influence the way it functions, because such an influence would be contrary to the mathematical relations exemplified in the laws of physics. The physical world cannot in any way be influenced by something that is not itself physical. Scientific materialism is therefore consistent with its philosophical cousin in asserting that everything is reducible to matter. In a book titled "Why I Am Not a Christian," British mathematician Bertrand Russell summarized his materialistic creed as follows, I quote, "Man is the product of causes which had no provision of the end they were achieving. His origin, his growth, his hopes and fears, his loves and his beliefs are but the outcome of accidental collocations of atoms." Only with the scaffolding of these truths, only on the firm foundation of unyielding despair, can the soul's salvation henceforth be safely built. End of quote. Scientific materialism thus reduces the status of man to that of a simple animal slightly more evolved than other animal species. Yet it is rife with errors, both scientific and philosophical. Firstly, given that science is nothing more than the application of reason to the observation of the material world, it is in no way empowered to make pronouncements about immaterial or supernatural realities. More to the point, it cannot reason on what is immaterial no more than a blind man can comment on the artistic merits of paintings, or a deaf person on those of a symphony. The existence of immaterial or supernatural beings is a metaphysical or meta-scientific question. That is, one which empirical science is by definition incapable of addressing. That is because the scientific method is geared solely to material beings. Beings that are immaterial are beyond its reach. The second error, and the most serious one, is that scientific materialism proposes a distorted view of material reality. As American physicist Stephen Barr has shown in his book titled Modern Physics and Ancient Faith, the scientific advances of the past 100 years compel us to call into question the foundations of scientific materialism. According to Barr, these advances can be associated with 5 stages of scientific development that he describes as plot twists. And these 5 plot twists are: 1, the Big Bang Theory; 2, the link between science and beauty; 3, anthropic coincidences; 4, quantum physics; and 5th, the Gödelian argument, according to which the mind cannot be explained in purely mechanistic terms. So let us examine 2 of these plot twists, which directly contradict scientific materialism. We start with the Big Bang Theory. The Judeo-Christian tradition says that our universe had a beginning. This belief in a beginning presupposes that there was a point before which neither physical reality, nor time, nor space existed. Until the 1960s, most scientists subscribing to a materialistic worldview rejected this idea of a beginning and simply assumed that the universe and time had always existed. This was called the steady state of the universe theory. In 1927, Georges Lemaître, a Catholic Belgian priest who taught astronomy and physics at the Catholic University of Louvain, published an article arguing that the universe is not static, as Albert Einstein then claimed, but in constant expansion. 4 years later, Father Lemaître published another article in which he argued that our universe originated from the explosion of a cosmic egg, which he named primeval atom, atome primitif in French. Lemaître's idea ran counter to the steady state theory and accorded with the Judeo-Christian belief that the universe had a beginning. It asserted that all that exists in the observable universe is the product of a gigantic explosion that took place some 13.7 billion years ago. The idea was not well received, and no less than Albert Einstein declared that he could not take it seriously. But the most outspoken critique was probably the British physicist Fred Hoyle, who mockingly referred to it as the Big Bang, and the name stuck. For a good part of the 20th century, a strong majority of astrophysicists persisted in arguing that the universe had no beginning. But then, two great discoveries tended to validate the hypothesis of Georges Lemaître. The first was made in 1927 by Edwin Hubble, who discovered two cosmic phenomena of which scientists had until then been unaware. The first was the rapid movement of galaxies away from ours, a movement that caused light from those galaxies to shift towards the red end of the color spectrum. This meant that the universe is in a state of constant expansion. The second discovery made by Hubble was that the speed at which celestial objects move away from one another increases as the distance between them increases. This discovery came to be known as Hubble's law. The primeval atom theory, according to which our universe exploded from an initial point, provided an explanation for why that would be so. Yet, for almost 30 years, the defenders of the steady state of the universe theory and those supportive of the Big Bang theory continued to oppose each other and seemed unable to arrive at some agreement until a further discovery was made in 1964 that finally settled the matter. In that year, two American scientists working for Bell Laboratories, Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson, detected on their scientific equipment what came to be known as cosmic background radiation. This radiation appeared to come from every part of the universe and shows that outer space is not extremely cold, as was then believed, but rather that it is somehow slightly lukewarm. This lukewarmness is fundamental to our understanding of the universe because it can only result from a very ancient source of heat, which gradually dissipated, as happens, for example, in an explosion. Most astrophysicists quickly concluded that the background radiation was the echo of the Big Bang, and that the primeval atom hypothesis of Georges Lemaître had been scientifically validated. The notion that time, space, and the universe as we know it had a beginning is a scientific discovery which seemed utterly absurd to most physicists and astronomers until the middle of the 20th century. And yet, that notion is now an integral part of modern cosmology. And it is perfectly compatible with the Judeo-Christian teaching about the beginning of the universe. Now, let's look at the anthropic coincidences described by Stephen Barr. Many contemporary scientists still believe that the universe is devoid of any meaning or purpose, and that man is nothing more than a byproduct of blind material forces. Indeed, according to distinguished scientists like Jacques Monod, Stephen Jay Gould, and Steven Weinberg, the great lesson to be drawn from the scientific discoveries of the past 5 centuries is best rendered by the words of the Greek philosopher Democritus, who lived some 2,400 years ago. Democritus said, and I quote, everything existing in the universe is the fruit of chance and necessity. End of quote. In other words, the universe has nothing to do with a supreme intelligence and simply issued from a blind chain reaction pileup of atoms. And yet, several recent discoveries in physics lead us to think that man was somehow potentially present from the very beginning of the universe. These discoveries are generally referred to as anthropic coincidences because certain features of the laws of physics appear to coincide exactly with what was required for the appearance of living species, including, of course, the human species. Even elementary constituents of life, such as carbon and water, depend on some mysterious fine-tuning at the subatomic level for which science has no explanation. Dozens of anthropic coincidences have been discovered. Here are just two examples. First, if the difference in mass between a proton and a neutron were not exactly as it is, roughly twice the mass of an electron, then all neutrons would have become protons or vice versa. That would have prevented the appearance of life as we know it. Second example, water is unique among molecules because it is denser as a liquid than as a solid, which is why ice floats. If that were not the case, the oceans would freeze from the bottom up and Earth would be covered with ice. This is due to unique properties of the hydrogen atom. As already mentioned, there are dozens of such coincidences and their number keeps rising. What they tell us is that we live in a universe that may well not be the product of chance and necessity. It is precisely in light of such consideration that the most famous atheist of the 20th century, British philosopher Anthony Flew, finally admitted the existence of God. In 1953, Flew published an article titled Theology and Falsification, in which he claimed to demonstrate that the existence of God was nothing less than impossible. Yet, a little over half a century later, Flew published a book asserting the very opposite. The book is titled, There is a God, How the Most Notorious Atheist Changed His Mind. The book is available on Amazon. In this book, Flew writes the following, I quote, "The leaders of science of the last 100 years, along with some of today's most influential scientists, have built a philosophically compelling vision of a rational universe that sprang from a divine mind." End of quote. Anthony Flew, the great 20th century apostle of atheism, thus became a theist. From his life experience, we can draw two conclusions. First, there is no scientific evidence disproving God's existence. And second, there are several scientific discoveries pointing towards his existence. They don't constitute a formal proof of existence, but they point to his existence. The same conclusion can be drawn from an examination of other subject matters such as quantum physics, the links between science and beauty, etc. But we must now turn to our second object, which is the contribution of Christianity to the development of science. Here we will focus on the contribution of the Middle Ages to scientific thought. Most modern historians have tended to view the Middle Ages as a 1,000-year break between Greco-Roman antiquity and the modern age. This idea assumed that medieval thinkers were devoid of any scientific mindset. It was first formulated by Francis Bacon at the end of the 16th century, and then given some prominence by French Enlightenment figures such as Voltaire, Diderot, Condorcet, and some British philosophers such as David Hume and Jeremy Bentham. It is still prevalent in today's popular imagination. It was only at the beginning of the 20th century that this idea of the Middle Ages being a gap or a pause in the scientific evolution of Western thought was finally challenged by the French physicist and historian Pierre Duhem. Having studied the origins of statics, Duhem discovered the works of several medieval mathematicians and scholars who had set the foundations of modern science and anticipated the works of Galileo. He concluded, and I quote, "The science of which we are nowadays legitimately proud derives from the science that was born around the year 1200. End of quote. The thesis of Duhem gave rise to numerous academic controversies throughout the 20th century. Today, however, few historians would dare to support the idea that we can simply jump over the Middle Ages in order to understand the origins of modern scientific thought. It is even now generally acknowledged that the scientific revolution would never have taken place had it not been for the patient and protracted preparatory work of medieval scholars. The contribution of the Middle Ages to the development of scientific thought can be analyzed through 4 stages. 1, the creation of an intellectual tradition based on Greco-Roman and Arabic knowledge. 2, the creation of universities. 3, the adoption of metaphysical principles conducive to the study of the natural world. 4, the valuing of the experimental method. So let's look at each of these separately. First of all, the creation of an intellectual tradition based on Greco-Roman and Arabic knowledge. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire at the end of the 5th century and the ensuing invasions by Huns, Viking, and Moors, the West largely abandoned philosophical and scientific inquiry. But in the early 12th century, medieval scholars began to translate into Latin works written in Greek and Arabic. This translation effort was driven by an awareness that Christendom, as the West then called itself, had fallen far behind other parts of the world in terms of intellectual achievements. For example, medieval scholars well understood that the Christian, Byzantine, and Muslim Arab civilizations held a store of knowledge far superior to their own. According to American historian Edward Grant, the translation of Greek and Arabic works by 12th and 13th century scholars likely represented, and I quote, "the largest intellectual appropriation by a culture and a civilization of the knowledge of other cultures and civilizations." End of quote. Second contribution, the creation of universities. As mentioned by many historians, the universities that appeared in the 12th and 13th centuries represented a genuine institutional innovation, nothing even remotely like them having ever existed in the Greco-Roman, Byzantine, Muslim, Chinese, or Indian cultures. For the first time in human history, an institution virtually independent of civil or religious authorities was founded for the sole purpose of teaching science natural philosophy, that meant the study of nature, and logic. More specifically, this institution was tasked with providing a higher education program of approximately 7 years based on a predetermined set of courses with natural philosophy as its most important component. As the number of universities kept increasing throughout the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries, a fixed curriculum focusing on logic, the sciences, and natural philosophy was delivered in Latin and made accessible everywhere in Europe, thus fostering the rise of a common European culture transcending the diversity of languages and local customs. In the early 16th century, Europe numbered 81 universities, 48 of which held a pontifical charter. According to historian Edward Grant, between 1200 and 1600, medieval natural philosophers in Western Christendom's universities accumulated and transmitted to their successors of the early modern era a rich heritage that has never been properly acknowledged. Third contribution, the adoption of metaphysical principles conducive to the study of nature. The Middle Ages also contributed to spreading principles and metaphysical assumptions essential to any scientific activity. The most important of these assumptions can be expressed as follows. 1. There is only one God who is Logos, reason. 2. A distinction between primary and secondary causes is essential to the understanding of the universe. 3. The nature of our universe can be apprehended with the language of mathematics. Regarding the first assumption, Logos is the Greek word transcribed as reason, word, or principle. The Gospel of John connected this Greek term with the nature and existence of God and Jesus Christ. The philosopher and historian of science, Stanley Jacqui, has highlighted the fact that the Judeo-Christian tradition always understood God as the source of all rationality. Throughout the Bible, says Jacqui, the regularity of natural phenomena attests to the existence of a God who is altogether order, beauty, and goodness. The intelligibility of the universe is a reflection of the mind of its creator, and we, as creatures made in his image and likeness, can use our reasoning faculty to discover that order, beauty, and goodness. The second metaphysical Judeo-Christian assumption has to do with the distinction between primary and secondary causes in the understanding of nature. This distinction was ultimately established by St. Thomas Aquinas, who speaks of God as the primary cause of all that exists, and of creatures as secondary causes. God is self-sufficient and the source of all that exists, including time and space. Creatures have their own internal consistency, but cannot exist without the consent of God, who literally willed them into existence. The primary cause is therefore unique and of an order entirely different from that of secondary causes. This distinction is paramount because it allows for the explanation of natural phenomena according to laws specific to them, while at the same time positing a first cause that belongs to an order transcending the natural order. That is a supernatural order. According to medieval scholars, the universe is intelligible because it was thought by God. The idea that the universe is intelligible presupposes the existence of a rationality from which that intelligibility originates. If such a rationality did not exist, How could we trust in the ability of the human mind to provide us reliable data about the world? A purely naturalistic understanding of the world cannot provide such assurance. The third metaphysical assumption that we have inherited from the Middle Ages is that nature can be understood through the language of mathematics. Like the Greek philosophers, medieval scholars well understood mathematics and the basics of natural philosophy. However, Greeks and medieval philosophers differed in their understanding of the relationship between these two disciplines. As far as the Greeks were concerned, there could be no relationship between mathematics and natural philosophy. Aristotle and his disciples begrudged the use of mathematical formulas to establish laws dealing with natural phenomena. Medieval scholars, for their part, saw mathematics as an integral part of the study of natural phenomena. This represented a very specific contribution to the development of science, which is generally attributed to English philosopher Roger Bacon, not to be confused with later Francis Bacon. Roger Bacon lived in the 13th century. Yes, science which is generally attributed to English philosopher Roger Bacon, as well as to a group of logicians, philosophers and scholars teaching at Oxford's Merton College, hence the name Mertonian calculators given to them. Finally, there is the experimental method. Medieval scholars were not satisfied with talking about the experimental method based on observation and experiment. They also applied it particularly in the field of medicine. Dissection of the human body was prohibited in Greco-Latin antiquity. Aristotle's anatomical studies were based solely on the dissection of animals. Human dissection was also prohibited in the Muslim world. It was only following the creation of the first medieval universities that human dissection was legitimized as a scientific exercise. Church and civil authorities of the time determined that since the soul was the distinctive feature of man, dissecting his body was legitimate for the purpose of medical science. From the foregoing, one may conclude that the concept of God that informs a culture has a definite influence on its ability to approach natural phenomena scientifically. Here it is perhaps appropriate to quote British philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, who in a book titled Science and the Modern World stated that the greatest contribution of the Middle Age to scientific thought was, and I quote, the insistence on the rationality of God conceived as with the personal energy of Jehovah and with the rationality of a Greek philosopher. End of quote. Today, few historians and philosophers would disagree openly with Whitehead's conclusions. The sad thing is that those conclusions have not yet percolated down in popular culture. Our job is to ensure that. Thank you.